Okay, we're going to get into some heavy shit in this one, so let's get the burning question out of the way first. Who the hell was actually nostalgic for Blockbuster Video? Whether you were working for it or shopping at it, Blockbuster was a shit company with shit selection and even shittier policies. As the name implied, if you were looking for, say, a foreign film that never went through the MPAA's rating system, or a classic film that was made before the modern rating system even existed, gasp, shock, you were shit out of luck. They treated their employees like crap, with long hours, low pay, and chronic understaffing. Not helped by the fact that all of their managers were choosy bastards who insisted on drug tests, as if manning a video store isn't the dream job of every stoned teenager in this country. Like they wouldn't line up around the block just for the chance to become Randall instead of Dante. Not that I'm still bitter about that time they didn't even call me back for a second interview. No. You're still bitter. And worst of all, the first thing they did, whenever they moved into a new territory, was either buy out all of the existing video stores, or drive them out of business through the power of name brand recognition. They were a ravenous monopoly that destroyed everything in their path, clearing the way for an even more ravenous monopoly to come along and wipe their entire industry out of existence. They were a perfect example of why that old line about how capitalism drives innovation through competition is a hideous lie, incepted into your brain by rich assholes who don't give a fuck about anything except getting all of your money. There. Having now balanced my karma, I will now proceed to say good things about a Disney Marvel superhero movie. By the grace of the old gods and the new, we now live in a world where both Captains Marvel have actual movies to their name. Not just TV movies either. Part of me still gets a kick out of that, even with all that's happened since. Personally, going in, I had no hope for either of them, because both of their journeys to the screen were long, convoluted stories, full of oft-depressing comic book and real-world history. I'll admit to not having much contact with Captain Carol Danvers, USAF, until around about 2005. Around the time Marvel Entertainment started thinking about maybe making its own film studio. But then they looked around and realized they'd sold the film rights to most of their popular female superheroes off to other movie companies. Even Carol's 50-plus year history is so tied up with the history of the X-Men that I, for one, couldn't imagine how anybody might winnow all of that down into a 2-hour and change origin story. The fact that they did that, in such a way that requires no previous knowledge of Carol or her supporting cast, that in fact introduces and ingratiates them to even the most apathetic civilian that I've shown this to in the last 2 years, is a great reflection of the craft involved, and on my own personal failures of imagination. So the X-Women were all at Fox, until Disney bought them back up in 2019. Ditto with Sue Storm Richards and her fucked up little family. Same with Elektra, who's forever cursed to be shackled to Daredevil and all of his Catholic guilt, and so immediately followed him over to Netflix. No one at Marvel wanted to risk starting a lawsuit war with Sony over, say, Jessica Drew or Mayday Parker, despite neither of them, or any of the other Spider-Women, as far as I know, being explicitly mentioned in Spider-Man's original rights deal. And I seem to be the only person left on Earth who remembers Alejandra, the Ghost Rider. This left Carol to be the standard bearer for pretty much the whole damn company, which called up its own host of issues. Carol's own history with the Avengers being mostly a parade of ugly betrayals, memory losses, depowerings, repowerings, comas, and that weird period where she was basically a ghost knocking around in Rogue's head. You really had to be there. And actually, those couple of episodes from the 90s animated X-Men series that deal with this cover it pretty well, honestly. I mean, for that series. None of which, quite rightly, this film directly references, choosing instead to go all the way back to the beginning and embed a few oblique references to it all throughout. This preserves the themes of Carol's fictional life while starting her off on a new and hopefully much better foot. Carol was supposed to be in the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, as if that team wasn't already unwieldy enough. Someone, probably Guardians co-writer Nicole Perlman, had a draft ready to go in 2013, and apparently the higher-ups at Marvel Entertainment hemmed and hawed about it for 6 damn years. Probably until Disney executives forced Marvel Entertainment CEO Ike Perlmutter and his Paleolithic girls don't buy toys mentality out of the film side of the company, so he could go ruin the VA with Donald fucking Trump, apparently. They were gonna get Ava DuVernay to do this, then Emily Carmichael, but they both turned it down because, at this point, Marvel is casting its directors as much as it's casting its actors. And some directors, as Marvel's distinguished competition knows all too well, have a really bad habit of wanting to put their own spin on things. Which is usually fine, except when changing anything would require scrapping hundreds of hours of work and thousands of hours of computer processing time, as is usually the case with these films. You gotta start those pre-visualizations 2 years in advance. As a result of all of this, when they aren't hiring recent Oscar winners or Robert Downey Jr.'s friends, Marvel's tended to go for TV veterans or hungry young indie directors, fresh off the festival circuit. Malleable charges who don't command big salaries and who will be all too glad to take the shit that rolls downhill. This has been their MO ever since James Gunn turned their Star Wars backup plan into a billion-dollar franchise. So here we have Ann Boden and Ryan Fleck. 2 people, if we're being honest, I'd never heard of before, but they made a movie set in an American high school in the mid-2000s. And to a big studio executive, that instantly means they must have some kind of connection with the youths. Do you ever just stop and stare at the vast machines that make all these movies? Marvel, har har, at their brilliance? Of course you don't, and you're probably happier for it. As is Marvel's by now standard, they did the best they could to capture the spirit of 50 years of comics without adhering to the letter of any of them. That means this is Captain Carol Danvers, USAF's, journey of self-discovery and self-rediscovery after catching a warp drive explosion with her face, suffering a bad case of movie amnesia, and getting press-ganged into the Kree Star Force. She must find herself, just as every new writing team has had to find her all over again, ever since Bob Layton, Dave Michelin, George Perez, and Jim Shooter gave us that infamous Avengers number 200. Just as every new reader must find her in every new reboot of her book. Counting all of them, across all media, this is functionally the 7th Captain Marvel #1 we've gotten in the last 10 years. And I think I like it better than all of them, stripped as it is of her comic book baggage. Or at least, second best, since none of this would probably exist without Kelly Sue DeConnick's run. So, salute. At first, she is Veers, a stray syllable, unmoored from the rest of herself as she is from the rest of humanity. She must recover her own full name, and eventually gain a new one, courtesy of Nicholas J. Fury. It's actually a very magical twist for a story that couches itself in the grammar of science fiction. Makes me think it's something like what Janosch Schwark tried and failed to do with Supergirl. Carol must relearn her true name in order to access her true power. with a little help, okay, a lot of help, from the healing power of friendship. Not love, or at least not the kind of cishet romantic love producers mean when they say, if this picture had love interest, it would gross twice as much. But friendship with a peer and comrade who knew Carol back when she knew herself. My sister's review of this was, and I quote, not gay enough, which can't argue with, but between the Chinese State Censorship Board and good old-fashioned American Puritanism, again, we're not going to get that anytime soon. By reclaiming the identity of Carol Danvers, she gains the power and the mantle of Captain Marvel, and the power to punch out starships. No disrespect to any of the comic book writers or artists who helped her get to this point in the first place, but that right there is the best origin story for Carol I've seen in 20 years. Straightforward, to the point, and self-contained, while grounding Carol in a web of relationships that can, and already have been, easily spun out into other movies. Granted, the recovery of her memories used to be a lot easier when she could just walk into Charles Xavier's school for gifted youngsters and arrange a few therapy sessions, but then again, you could say that for a lot of things in this universe. Y'all motherfuckers need X-Men, is what I'm trying to say. Or at least Chucky Boy. Of course, the Kree are the real bad guys. Spoiler alert for a Marvel movie that made $1 billion 2 years ago. Ronan, the villain of Guardians, was Kree, though not much was made of his race back then, or of the Kree Star Force's long history of empire-mongering. Beyond one blink and you'll miss it line. Just like how you'll miss Ronan's presence here. Turns out, the Accuser was less of a boy with boring politics back here in 1995, when he had a real big boy job calling shots for the Kree's bomber starships. Wonder if Carol was supposed to start off as one of Ronan's hench people, and then Star-Lord was supposed to go, hey, yo, you're from Earth. And she would have been like, what? No. And he would have been like, no, really, you're from Earth, goddammit. And then that would have brought up all kinds of uncomfortable questions, which could have led into this movie. But, whatever. Instead, we get this, which is technically a prequel to every other Marvel movie, except for the first 8/10 of Captain America: The First Avenger. For all the Air Force tie-in advertising that preceded its release, poisoning its well for most of my fellow lefty critics, even though nobody remembers any of that now, this film does contain a bit of a stealth commentary on the forever wars the USAF has been happily participating in these last 2 decades, and that Carol gets to not participate in by virtue of her story taking place in 1995. Unfortunately, that commentary is buried in the Kree, probably because that was the only way anyone could sneak an anti-war critique through the production line of America's culture industry. Which, lest we forget, for a movie this size, with this many military toys to play with, runs right through the Pentagon's own censorship board. So in the Kree, we see a technologically sophisticated empire that has driven itself into bouts of paranoid schizophrenia after years, decades, of fighting an enemy, the Skrulls, who could be anywhere, or anyone, and strike out at any time. For reasons the Kree don't even bother speculating about. The better to avoid considering the possibility that the Skrulls might be fighting for something. Like, say, for example, their own survival. Instead, the Kree seek out and destroy the Skrulls wherever they find them, sending either massive bomber wings to just nuke planets from orbit, it's the only way to be sure, inserting small teams of Tier 1 operators and spies into the local populace, or both. Usually both. And then they wonder why nobody likes them. Gee, Big mystery. Can't imagine how they wound up in the situation they're in by the time Guardians 1 opens up. Except the Kree don't wonder, because they're told that they're doing the right and proper and just thing by every level of their highly militarized society. Especially the supreme intelligence who leads them. An AI who appears to them in the form of someone from their past whom they most trusted, even if they have no effective memory of who that person was, or what their relationship might have been. I'd say something snarky here, like, and this is the future liberals want, except it's actually the present that we kind of have right now, so that's not even really a joke. On the broadest possible level, Veer's indoctrination into the Kree Star Force is a great metaphor for how right-wing propaganda actually works. Yes, it does trickle down from the top of an authoritarian hierarchy, but it only really works when it's filtered through a trusted source. And no matter who you are, or what you believe in, you're much less willing to question it when everybody around you parrots it back to you. For the good of all Kree, Veers and her Star Force teammates all say, because it's a catchism. And the best way to participate in a genocidal war of conquest is to convince yourself, and especially your troops, that you're actually fighting a defensive war against an existential threat to your civilization. And perhaps even your own sense of self. Know your enemy. It could be you. Love that line. Pay no attention to how your boss, say, or your boss's boss, undermines your sense of self at every turn, forcing you to rely on them for reassurance. And yes, this is exactly how cults work. Even the most successful cults, like organized religions, nation-states, and their militaries. But pay no attention to that either. Higher, farther, faster, baby. And to top it all off, they put a chip on her neck. Not so clunky or obvious as the power-inhibiting collars that are usually used for this purpose in both major comic book universes. But the principle is the same, and the subtlety of the chip works in the movie's favor. Carol barely notices it over the course of her journey, and I straight up forgot it was there until the climax. But if it were my neck, I'd have ripped that damn thing off as soon as the truth came flooding back to me, in a tide of old photographs and my niece's voice. But that wouldn't have been properly climactic now, would it? I also find it interesting, at a time when the entire English-speaking right wing seems to believe some version of the shape-shifting reptile aliens conspiracy theory, that along comes a $200 million film with the explicit intent of making us sympathize with the shape-shifting reptile aliens. Going out of its way to, for lack of a better word, humanize them. Never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually glad the Fantastic Four aren't around to fuck this up. They, of course, have their own long, convoluted history with the Skrulls. Hasn't been nearly this friendly. If anything, the Skrulls are too humanized. Stuck in a cloaked, orbiting refugee ship with one pinball machine between them. Wearing human clothes, and having what sure looked to me like nuclear families. Including the one headed by Ben Mendelsohn's General Talos. But, then again, the aliens aren't alien enough is a criticism you can label at pretty much every alien race we've come up with since before Gene Roddenberry came up with Star Trek. And the obvious counter-argument is, we're still pretty damn xenophobic down here on planet C-53, even to people who just come from different parts of our own planet. I do love how Earth is such a backwater shithole that it doesn't even get a name on the Kree Star Force charts. Just a letter and a number. C-53. Whoever discovered us didn't even want to waste their own name on us. Or the name of some dead god or mythological figure. It's a position I wish Earth would inhabit more in these comic book universes. Maybe I'm just sick of all the alien invasions. Good thing Carol stops this one before it even really gets started. kind of a secret invasion, when you think about it. Mendelssohn's another interesting case here. A man who went from Australian award winner and TV vet to typecast Hollywood villain, faster than anyone since Hugo Weaving. His casting as Talos here is designed to prime the viewer into mistrusting him, just as Jude Law's casting as Jan-Rog is supposed to prime my mom, or anyone with my mom's taste in dudes, into trusting him. The fact Jan-Rog and Veers start the movie as friendly co-workers, while Talos kidnaps her and puts her in the brain-scanning machine also helps. But without that brain-scanning machine, just how much of Carol Danvers would Veers have been able to recover? I like how the movie doesn't answer my question, directly or indirectly. Especially since this is still a Marvel film, so it feels the need to patiently explain everything else to an audience of assumed children. And, of course, I like the fact we got to spend a whole movie, or mostly a whole movie, with Samuel L. Jackson. And that he is the one who comes up with Carol's final name. Of course, they play it cute. I mean, look who we're talking about here. It's Marvel. 2 words, Carol says. The hyphen being silent, apparently. And Nicholas J. Fury responds, correctly, Marvel sounds better. The prequelitis is very cute with this one, and thankfully mostly confined to the end. Yes, we do get a digitally de-aged Fury, with Carol for the duration. And at first he's partnered with a equally de-aged Coulson. And here I have to rescind my praise for Disney's de-aging technology, because, after all, I know what 1995 Sam Jackson looked like. But this concludes the film's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show, until Fury's back at his desk, drafting the Avengers Initiative and naming it after Carol's old call sign. Of course, there was some controversy about all this, and of course, it was about the stupidest bullshit you could imagine. The idea that Nick Fury, of all people, might have told a lie about what happened to his eye to sound cooler back in Captain America 2, that was just too much for people. Because if there's one thing we know about Nick Fury, it's that he's honest to a fault in all situations. Am I right? No, really. Some people, a very small number of people, making this argument in good faith, assuming they even exist, had a problem seeing Nick as just another agent, called into the field to deal with weird shit, rather than the not-so-secret puppet master of every plot that he's in. They felt that this version of him, younger, scrappier, scrambling to find ad hoc spy-fi solutions to whatever trouble he's gotten himself into, somehow undermines his character. As if the revelation, again in Winter Soldier, that he'd been carrying water for the literal neo-Nazis of Hydra for literal decades didn't already do that back in 2014. But by successfully importing this whole shared universe thing to film, Marvel has unfortunately imported all of its worst aspects, including the selective amnesia of its fans. You all should be up in arms about the fact that everybody just knows what S.H.I.E.L.D. is, even though in Iron Man 1, everybody was like, what? Huh? Strategic Homeland blah-de-blah-de-blah. No, fuck that. Change the name. Here, it's 1995, and both the LAPD and the U.S. Air Force are just like, yeah, sure, whatever, come on at her. Though I guess this is supposed to be what Coulson meant when he said that they'd dealt with things like this before. Unless he was talking about the Hulk. But some of us dance to remember, even if we remember too much. My only actual criticism of this film boils down to it's a PG-13 remake of The Long Kiss Goodnight, which sounds like either an insult or a backhanded compliment. But as PG-13 remakes of The Long Kiss Goodnight go, this one's pretty good. And I don't mean this to be pithy, I'm serious. An amnesiac white lady superhero, and let's face it, super spies are just superheroes for people who take themselves too seriously to read comic books, must recover her memories and stop the evil machinations of her former superiors, whom, it naturally turns out, are the real bad guys and have been all along. With a little, or, let's be honest, a lot of help from Samuel L. Jackson. But unfortunately, no one remembers The Long Kiss Goodnight anymore. Except for me, my friends, my fellow Shane Black fans, and a whole lot of deranged conspiracy theorists who think it's predictive programming instead of the best action movie of 1996. Captain Marvel might not be the best action movie of 2019, but it is the best Marvel movie. And that's not nothing. Personally, I see it as a throwback, not to the 1990s in which it's set, but to those halcyon days of 2008 through 12. Phase 1 of this Marvel Universe's grand rollout, when formerly B-tier heroes and their supporting casts were suddenly thrust into the international spotlight. And we found out those heroes and their supporting casts could carry a 2-hour movie just fine. Turns out the tier lists were in our heads the whole time. You'd think we would have learned this with the X-Men, but always helps to have another example on hand. Now we live in a world where Carol Danvers has her own movie, and it does not outright suck, which is more than I ever dreamed possible. In 2019, I took that as a sign that maybe I should dream a little bigger. Then, of course, 2020 happened, but I'm trying to accentuate the positive here, folks. But like I said, we're in a world where both Captains Marvel have movies to their name. That doesn't let you know that anything is possible. I don't know what will. Thanks for watching, everyone. Like, comment, subscribe, like you do. And if you want to support the show, then consider giving me money on Patreon. Like the fine people whose names I'm about to read to you right now. Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G. Next time, I'm about to go say some very mean things about a Godzilla movie, and probably alienate my base way more than I will by saying nice things about this movie.